Good morning. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, David. Thank you, the Consulate, and thank you, everybody, for tuning into this very important type of discussion. Today, we're going to start this panel with probably the most important opening that we could have to discuss expression, but most specifically in digital spaces. And the reason why we're going to be speaking about that is because we're sitting in the borderlands of that. By speaking about tech responsibility and talking about tech ethics, we're talking about a space in which the internet, technology, and digital spaces don't actually leave us anymore in the distance. We share those spaces in physical space. We're in the internet right now. So my background is in education, and I'm a professor at Queens College, but I had started an internet studies degree back in 2013, back when people were like, why are we studying this? But later I ended up doing my PhD in memes and cultural politics. And so I'm an expert in that, but as you can imagine, the last 6 years have been quite interesting. So today what I want to do is actually not talk about what I do, but talk about with these experts who are about to come up to this panel, who are the utmost experts of talking about expression and what it means to have free speech. And so I'd like to introduce, bring up to the panel, Suzanne Nossel, CEO of PEN America and the author of Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. Amruta Deshpande, researcher at Graphika. And Nora Benavidez, the Director of Digital Justice and Civil Rights at Free Press. Thank you all for being here. So I think just to start off the conversation, just to begin from where it is, because I would like to hear your voices on this, is to continue a question that came up earlier about what does it mean to have free expression, but the unequal distribution of power and the vulnerable. So what does it mean when we have our ability to have the privilege of being here, to have the privilege of having to have safety online? And what does it mean? And where's the difference between those who don't have that ability to have that power in spaces? What does free expression mean when we're talking about how we exert the ability to actually express and speak about what we want to?
Yeah, I think one obvious implication is that it's not just as simple as free speech for all at a completely unconstrained social media landscape, that if that were the operative rule, kind of free speech for all would really mean free speech for none. And that we have to think about ourselves as really as kind of guardians of open discourse. That's sort of how we think about it at PEN America, where we're looking at the breadth of threats to free expression, not just government encroachments on free speech, the kinds of things addressed under the First Amendment, not just rules that companies impose, but also the challenges that arise with speech versus speech, things like doxing and harassment that can drive people offline and silence their voices. All of that is part and parcel of how we try to sustain open discourse online. And you see different free speech equities pitted against each other all the time. We have right now in Texas, Facebook, Meta, and other tech platforms arguing vociferously that under the First Amendment, they shouldn't be forced to be transparent in terms of their policies and usage rules and algorithms. And they're asserting a First Amendment claim. On the other side, you have another First Amendment claim, which is that it's in the interests of users and the general public that this information should be accessible. We have a right to know. If we don't understand this, we can't understand how these platforms are influencing our society and our political discourse. And so it becomes complicated, and figuring out what rules we can find or divine to adjudicate these competing claims, each of which has some grounding in free speech. The First Amendment gets thrown around, the ideal of free speech gets thrown around. It's the same thing when it comes to forms of speech that we find harmful on platforms. Many of them, as a legal matter, would be considered protected speech under the First Amendment. A lot of what we construe as harassment or hate speech could not be banned or punished in this country by law. And yet we recognize that if that courses freely through online platforms, that drives people away, it intimidates, it silences certain debates and discussions. And so I think what that forces on us as free speech defenders is a much more robust, engaged, complex examination of these questions where there really are no easy answers.
You know, I've been doing some old readings trying to think about free expression lately. And of course, when you don't know an answer, right, you go all the way back to what? Ancient Greece. And, you know, I've been doing readings on these various definitions of what free speech means. And to your question, you know, how are we here? What are we engaged in? What are we doing? You know, who's taking part in this? There have been various competing definitions of free expression for so long. And I feel like we have honed in culturally on a few different ones. There are two that I think about regularly. One is called parousia, and it is the bravado to be able to speak, to come before people. And really, there's sort of a quality of VIP in it, that you come before someone and you're making your voice heard, irrespective if it will offend. And then there's this other concept called isagoria, and it is oftentimes the ability to come before the public square, and that every single person in ancient Athens had the ability to come before their fellow citizens to speak. Very poor people were paid to come to the public square to speak, because it was so important in that word and in that definition that everyone's voice was heard. And now I look at, if we take a step back, this moment, and that it feels like people can never agree on what free speech means. Whether it is what platforms say they have a right to do under the First Amendment, or what citizens and others think they have a right to do, it all seems to flow from the different ways that we define what free expression means. Whether it is the ability to say whatever, absent consequence, even if it must be said. There are kernels of that in so many of the issues we think about now, or the ability around the world, and this is what I increasingly think about when I think about free expression, which is really, how is there equal speech? How do we achieve that? When we see so often more and more evidence that there are barriers to entry for people to speak, whether it is language, the fact that we know platforms are grossly asymmetrical when they are moderating and enforcing speech, depending on language, whether it is other ways that people of color or dissenting opinions around the world are censored for their speech. And so I think that there are these competing values that we still are wrestling with all the time. And when we come to the table, I don't want to say, oh, let's spend time defining what the word means, but I think it's really interesting to your first question of how do we actually parse through what we each mean? Is it equity of speech? Is it the ability to say anything? There are a lot of different levels here that we have to parse through together.
I wholeheartedly agree with what Suzanne and Nora have both said. The thing that I guess maybe I'll highlight, since they've covered a lot of it already, is in the environment where speech is unconstrained, let me say, instead of calling it free, unconstrained speech certainly has created an environment where there's an information space that is actually limiting the individual's understanding of what is true, what is real, what is believable. This is the danger that we've sort of found ourselves in at this point in time, and that certainly is a very strong impetus for revisiting the questions that both Suzanne and Nora have raised about let's define free speech a little bit more clearly so that we can protect people from having to understand the entire world in order to understand a small kernel of truth. The information space is very wide and it's very difficult to navigate. So it's hard to know what to trust.
Excellent, thank you. So I'd like to look at this from a little bit from the other side as well. In your book, Suzanne, you write about the unwritten rules of speech, the ability to have that arbitrary space of knowing how to interact. And you relate at the beginning of it to driving. Like we know that the line is invisible or it doesn't do anything, but we know to stay in our lanes. And so there's like an agreement we make. And where does it, so I bring this conversation up a lot of times in class about how it's seen from another side, from the content moderation space. And I often try to explain to students that when you use the internet, you're using content moderation. Like that is the internet. That's how you have access to it. So there is an acceptable space of speech, but there's also the acceptable space of receiving expression. There's a space where we get that from. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of where is that border? Where is the space between what affects and what doesn't? I mean, most of us know this, where it might come to harm or kinetic energy that comes from speech. But very often when we deal with free speech absolutionists that are trying to find ways to change those types of content moderation rules. Where do we have to kind of consider this? Where does that come in when we have to start to think about how we could explain that to those who don't really think about content moderation at all? They just think of it as a tool of expression.
Yeah, sure. The interesting thing about content moderation, I was recently reading an article, an older article by Joan Donovan and Dana Boyd, is that if you think about content, if you think about news broadcasts, that is all moderated content, if you will. When we have and they do that because they're speaking in front of a large audience, and that has consequences. If you yell fire in a crowded theater, you're likely to cause panic and harm. Moderation is very important when you have a very large audience and you have to consider the harm that you might be causing. In the space where individuals without information are freely exchanging information, whether or not they fully believe it, fully understand it, that certainly presents a case for considering moderation. Stop there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would add is, and I talk about this in the book, that I think it's useful to take a step back and remember why it is that we care about and protect free speech in the first place. It's not just because, you know, we see an inherent value in people being able to, you know, speak out whatever comes to their heads. We all moderate our own speech and content constantly. I'm thinking about what I say and don't say, you know, here in this panel. What do I want to come across to you? I may have thoughts that I keep to myself for very good reason in the professional setting, in the family setting. So we're always all moderating. We don't say everything that comes to mind. And free speech is not about enabling, you know, every last thought to be voiced or put into words. It's about if we look at why we protect free speech, it's because we believe free speech has value in society, that free speech is a catalyst for truth, that if we have an open environment for ideas, that we'll be able to sort out truth from falsehood, that the best ideas will rise to the fore, that we can build on them, that those can be engines of societal progress, that free speech makes possible creativity and scientific innovation and democracy, deliberation about what are the best policies for our society. So if you think about all of those goods that underpin our commitment to free speech, well, what does that imply? You know, it's that speech is not just the right to say everything that comes to your mind. It's the right to engage. It's the right to persuade, to advance your ideas, to argue in favor of them, to rebut what someone else may put forward. And you need an environment where you can do that. And if the arena is so flooded, for example, with disinformation and falsehood, and if you have a public that has lost its ability to discern the difference between truth and falsehood, the value of free speech disintegrates. And, you know, I think we're seeing that in our own discourse right now, that we cannot break through, even with very persuasive arguments, facts, data on something like COVID. There is a segment of the population, you know, that has walled itself off, is not willing to listen to that. And, you know, the power of speech in the hands of even our, you know, most credible, well-grounded experts is severely diminished to all of our detriment. And so, you know, in my view, when we think about moderation, it's really about kind of creating an environment that can enable some of those benefits of free speech. Now, of course, what's so difficult is that we don't all agree on where the boundaries lie, you know, to your point, that, you know, and who arbitrates that. And a lot of that power is in the hands of private companies. Now there are much more aggressive mechanisms. The Oversight Board is one, European regulation is another, to try to intrude on that and contest that. And, you know, ultimately, I think that's a good thing, because I think we have to navigate the question of where these boundaries are set. I think the more discussion and deliberation about them, the better, the more likely we are to get it right.
So I want to go a little bit more technical. It's talking about care and the ability to navigate Silicon Valley's hegemony over a lot of these speech. Recently, there was an article that came up from Taylor Lorenz about algo speak. And algo speak is the the decision that users make to go around content moderators by disguising things, whether that be through graphical communication, by embedding in it memes, whether that be embedded in puns, or whether that be embedded in just language that is moving. This is happening at the exact same time as our flexibility of language, an era of accountability that's going on right now, where we are understanding that language doesn't have to be static, that we could understand it in ways that extend care to those who may not have ever had the ability to express previously. So how do these two factors come into play when the algorithm itself is doing some sort of mitigation of content and people are moving around it, but at the same time, people are wishing to express themselves more because they feel safer. It's not just the time in which people can have more say, it's because they're feeling safer to have that more say. So how do we protect the person who's safer? At the same time, the machines are trying to learn how to mitigate that as well.
I can start. I mean, I think I would start with, the plethora of things we do not actually know about the algorithms and about who sees what the engagement and the life cycle of content really is across various platforms. So to ask the question, and I know you love memes, Jamie, I was waiting for your question on memes, to ask how does that move for people and how might there be care involved in that? It involves, frankly, a whole set of data points we don't really have. First and foremost, the favorite line is that social media companies are black boxes. What that really means, I think, if we kind of take a step back, is that there is so much about the back-end systems and the ways that AI and other machine learning are making decisions about content, whether that's to amplify or to, based on the data that has been taken about each of us online, provide unique and tailored pieces of content for our eyeballs. We don't know much about all of those decisions. Layered on top of that then is really that when we ask, and I often try to ask companies, can you give me even the median data points about what a life cycle of a piece of content is like? A problematic one could be images that display voter fraud incidents and that those might then contain misinfo. But I never get those data points from companies. And it's not necessarily that it's all malicious. I think a lot of it is that each of these companies are big. They say, oh, well, that team over there has the information. And so then I learn a little tiny sliver of data about Thailand misinformation in 2008. And then I go, well, can I learn about a little bit of moderation and what the algorithms are doing over here? And they go, oh, well, we're really a startup, so give us a minute. And, these companies have now been around for over a decade. And so taken together, all of that, I think, actually makes answering your question very, very difficult, because we're feeling around still in the dark for pieces of information, for frankly, like trying to wrap our arms around what the problem really is. And so it's why a lot of my work now deals with transparency. How do we advance policies, both through Congress, through state legislation, as well as then put pressure on companies themselves to enhance their transparency? I sometimes call it, show us the receipts, like give us stuff so we can work together, whether that is researcher access. Let's take an example, the NYU Ad Observatory researchers, when they tried to research what was happening on Facebook, they were denied access to the platform to be able to understand what the life cycle of content and ads looked like. Those are like such easy starting places. If transparency is the foundation, from there we can start to ascertain some of the answers to what you've asked.
Yeah, fully agree with starting with transparency. I think I'll add a complication in that mix. I recognize that many of these algorithms that do moderation might not be fully explainable. And so people might struggle to come around that barrier as well. I know there's many efforts to increase explainable technologies, but at the same time, it doesn't I want to underscore the importance of gaining that understanding. And people are making decisions and choices for technology based on whatever they can see. There should be some way of communicating that information.
Yeah, I mean, just a small thing to add, going back to your original question, one of the most frequent arguments that the platforms make about why they don't want to reveal more about the algorithms is precisely because of kind of gaming and how people manipulate and adjust the ways in which they communicate in order to evade what the algorithms will do and mechanisms to suppress offensive or harmful content. And so, for us as an oversight board, one thing that's been extremely important and valuable is getting more people involved in our work who have been inside these platforms and can actually talk from an inside perspective about how it really works and whether an argument that's being put forward as a barrier, to say, well, if we were transparent, then of course, people would game the system and all this harmful content would flow freely, and there'd be nothing we could do, and we'd be just opening the floodgates to that. To really battle test that claim and be able to come back and say, here's what we want to see, or, here's how we suggest you might go about this to avoid what you say are these barriers.
Thank you. So one more question to reframe it so we feel empowered to act upon this. One of the big things that had happened that I think was really enlightening to the public was the Facebook papers, that it didn't just reveal that the harms we were aware of, but it revealed that the company was aware of as well. And I think that companies have a responsibility, as mentioned in your book too, that the powerful have a responsibility to this. So influence is not equally distributed. We do not all have the same say. We do not all have the same way of communicating with the public. There's a privilege for us up here. There's a privilege for us online. But when it comes to a hegemonic structure like social media itself, where policy is being decided and authoritarian leaders are having a way of actually shifting the way that law exists, how do we as a public, those here in the room and at home, how do we as a public become aware enough of these tools? And I'm always thinking of the educational standpoint here. How do we become empowered to ask the right questions? What advice can you give for that?
Yeah, look, I think it's tough. It's very tough. I mean, there's the tremendous opacity and technicality that stands in the way of that. As I mentioned, one of the things that's been really useful to us as an oversight board, and I think we recognized we needed more expertise. We needed people who had been on the inside of these companies, could get under the hood and really tell us, when we meet with the company, are we getting a straight story? What else should we be asking? Where should we be probing? And it's a useful forum because we do have access to certain things that the public doesn't, that we can request in the context of reviewing a case. And part of the challenge, of course, is kind of how to make sense of the information when you get it. The volumes can be vast, and you can just sort of drown in a sea if you're not careful, if you don't know exactly what you're looking for, if you don't have the expertise. So I do think greater transparency and access for researchers. I mean, we've all been hammering on that point and from our different perches for years with a lot of frustration. And, one of the excuses given has been in relation to privacy. And there's, I think, a very sound proposal to create a safe harbor so that the companies, as long as they implement basic privacy restrictions, cannot be considered to be in violation of their agreements with users if they provide data to researchers for research purposes. I think that's extremely important. But of course, we have a hamstrung Congress right now. I do think it's going to be interesting to see what happens as these European regulations are imposed. I mean, now the Texas law, the stay of the law has been lifted by the Court of Appeals. So that law will go into effect. It has very robust transparency requirements, and that's going to be a very interesting experiment. I don't know what the companies are going to do. Are they going to, pull out of Texas? It remains to be seen. But if they stay in, I think we're going to learn something.
So it's very difficult as a consumer to know exactly where you should go. People are starting to be aware of the concept of fake news, but that's also worked out backwards. So now anybody can yell fake news and it just creates more confusion. There's also this broader, so in principle, the need is for education. We all need to understand and be aware of the things we need to be on the lookout for. But how do we get that information? We are, we live our lives and we do our thing. So where do we get that information from? So that sort of traces it back to whose responsibility is it? There's been this question for a while. Does it lie with the governments? Does it lie in the private sector? Does it lie in the social area? And I'm just going to keep complicating this. And it varies with age a lot. So you can start trying to introduce some of this education for children. you can start making people aware at that level. But there's plenty of people that are, that are in their 70s, that are in their 60s now, that it's a very different age range, but they're also victims to the same disinformation, misinformation. How are they going to get that? I think there's been some convincing arguments made for community-based organizing to maybe do something to get the ball rolling. There's a bigger question of whose responsibility it is or it should be. But I think from what I've heard most recently in the last few months, people generally believe that it has to be a cross-organizational effort. It's been mentioned already before that we really need a system that connects all industry and all these different parts of the world together so we can have a free exchange of information and ideas so that we can find better solutions that will reach the people that they need to reach.
So sorry. This is my first speaking engagement in person since COVID. It's been really exciting. I love the microphone. It's such a blast. So, I think there were two things that really rose to the surface for me when the Facebook papers came out. And then recently, Gizmodo released more. And so there is so much to sift through that I don't feel any of us, if you can, please let me know and raise your hand, but I don't know if any of us have been able to go through every piece of document and analyze what it means. There are so many acronyms within the Facebook papers that I go back to my own little ledger to make sure I know what the different acronyms mean and, odd phrases. But there were two things that really rose to the surface. One was the mechanisms that Facebook implemented ahead of the 2020 elections in the United States, which they referred to as break glass measures. To me, what that showed was that there is know-how on the part of social media companies to mitigate the spread and the visibility of the stickiness of some of the worst stuff. And that is junk content, that is hate, extremism, conspiracy theories, disinfo, that there were mechanisms in place and that in the week around the November 2020 election, one of these companies implemented those and increased resourcing for their civic integrity team. And then something happened. Mid-November came and they minimized those resources for the civic integrity team. And they essentially, what they called was turned off the break glass measures. Or what we don't really know is what is included in those break glass measures. But that was something that was really interesting to me. The other thing that rose to the surface was about how much resourcing is spent on non-English moderation. The flip side is how much is spent on English. About 87% of the resourcing for moderation and enforcement, we learned, was spent on English content. There are over 25 other major languages spoken around the world. We could go on and on about how many languages generally are spoken. And I think together that speaks to a much larger problem that around the world, if we're coming together here from so many places, together, what that shows is that companies have the know-how to mitigate the spread of the worst stuff, but they do it anecdotally. We've seen that with Twitter, we've seen it with YouTube, we've seen it with TikTok, that there are these sort of inflection points when a company says, there's going to be virality and stickiness of certain stuff and we need to mitigate. Well, that needs to be happening 24/7 year-round because democracies, as we know, are not threatened anecdotally. That COVID disinformation is actually related to the distrust that we have in the voting process, in that government institutions might undermine something related to me and mine. And so we can't treat these things as like, oh, suddenly let's have a surge of doing the right stuff. We also have to make sure that we're increasing resourcing for non-English moderation across platforms. We know that Latinos were targeted in the US ahead of the 2020 election with a kind of fervor that we've seen similar to the way US Black Americans were targeted in 2016 and 2018. But that was still in English. And so this new non-English space is going to be one of the questions that I think we have to ask. And we have to keep doggedly pursuing answers. Because when I go to companies, and I don't want to focus on Facebook alone, I think across the board, when I go to these companies and I say, can you give me data about this? I'm asking the right question. And there is very little that we still get. So again, that comes back to the transparency piece, but it can't be the only mechanism for accountability. So we have to come to the problem being able to say, here is the whole of what we need. We need algorithms that are not amplifying the worst stuff. You know how to do that. And then the other is we need you to protect people equally across the world.
Thank you so much. These are wonderful questions. We have a whole day to discuss this, and these thank you so much to our panelists. We're going to move to the next one now. These questions are excellent. I think the most important thing that I took from what you said is that we have to extend care and we have to think about community. And I think that's really important, is that we have to think when we're hearing things that are false, when we see non-transparent things, we have to think about how we collectively can start pushing back against that. So thank you to the three of you. Please give them a round of applause for their excellent answers here, and really appreciate your time today. Thank you.